Everybody, so glad you could join us today. Here's what we're going to do. With me is Greg Baylor, Mr. Greg Baylor. He is an attorney with the Alliance for Defending Freedom. And what I wanted to be able to do is have a discussion about something that is going before both the Congress and the Senate, which is called the Equality Act. This particular moment is one of those collisions between civil rights and religious freedom. And there's often this collision that's happening in our culture. Of course, as a pastor and as a church, we're thinking a lot about both of those important things. So first of all, Greg, tell us a little bit about you. Where are you from, and a little bit about you and your background.
Yeah, sure. Well, right now I'm honored to serve as an attorney with Alliance Defending Freedom. I'm director of our Center for Religious Schools. I also have another hat that I wear, Senior Counsel for Governmental Affairs. But I'm here in Washington, D.C. I live with my family, my wife, who's a medical doctor, and two daughters in suburban D.C. out in Virginia. I was born in Pittsburgh and spent a few years there, still a Steeler fan, before moving to suburban New York City, which is where I grew up. Went to college in New Hampshire and law school in North Carolina. And I'm an adult convert. It really hit me during my law school years and shortly afterwards. And after a few jobs working for a judge and working for some law firms, I was called to devote my vocational career to defending religious liberty. And I've been privileged to do that for about 26 years now, previously with Christian Legal Society and their Center for Law and Religious Freedom, and now with Alliance Defending Freedom. So thanks for having me on your broadcast. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. So, okay. So we appreciate your role in helping to defend religious freedom. Obviously, this is something very important to us, not just here in the U.S., but around the world. And so talk about, there's so much information about the Equality Act. Could you, in a few sentences, sort of summarize what's being proposed?
Sure. Essentially, what it does is that it takes existing laws that forbid discrimination and adds sexual orientation and gender identity as protected classifications. The other main thing it does is that it takes away the religious freedom rights that we currently have under federal statutory law, so that folks whose religious freedom is burdened or interfered with by the proposed law will not be able to defend themselves adequately. Let me give you a few more specifics about that, if I may. So I said that the Equality Act takes existing laws and changes them and adds sexual orientation and gender identity. What are those laws? Well, in 1964, the Congress adopted the most significant civil rights statute in our nation's history, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And it takes the situations that they were facing and tried to make them better. African Americans were facing discrimination in a variety of contexts, including what the law calls places of public accommodation, which is like hotels and restaurants and things like that. African Americans had difficulty traveling interstate, particularly in the South in the 60s, because of the color of their skin. They couldn't get a seat at a restaurant or a room at a hotel. And Congress responded to that, appropriately so. The law also covers things like employment, things like housing, and it also attaches a sort of a non-discrimination string to recipients of federal financial assistance. Now, the interesting thing is each one of these parts of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 has a different list of protected classes. Some say race, color, and religion, and that's it. Some say race, color, religion, sex, national origin, and on it goes. And Congress was being careful to deal with the problems that existed when it passed these laws. And so what the Equality Act would do, again, is to add sexual orientation, gender identity to each of these statutes, and then take away our ability to defend ourselves. I can talk more about the consequences of that, but that's a good, I think, kind of technical overview of what the Equality Act would do.
Okay, so a lot of us would look and hear the words, civil rights or not non-discrimination, and we would think that's great, right? We want people to be protected. We want people to be able to have access to things. The Civil Rights Act that happened in the 1960s was obviously a major improvement to our society. But then you have this idea that somebody might have a conviction against something from a religious perspective when it comes to gender identity. And you said, what was the second part? Sexuality?
The sexual orientation, homosexuality, bisexuality. Yeah.
So are there some examples of where this collision has happened?
Yeah. Well, I think you made a good point at the beginning is that, this really does sound good. And as Americans, we're committed to the principle of non-discrimination. And my organization, Alliance Defending Freedom, and I personally think that people who identify as LGBT should not be unjustly discriminated against. But that truth, that reality, that position doesn't really dictate the answer to the question, should we pass something like the Equality Act? And in our judgment, I think the answer is no. Here are some of the things that I think, well, let me back up. One of the reasons why laws that outlaw gender identity and sexual orientation discrimination are so problematic is because of the understanding of the things that count as gender identity and sexual orientation discrimination. When you hear that, you think of, okay, a trans person shows up at the emergency room and they have a broken leg, and the doctor says, you know what, I don't like trans people, I'm not going to set your leg. That is unjust discrimination. It really is. And that should not happen. However, sure, the Equality Act would address situations like that, question whether that is happening very frequently, and the evidence suggests that it really isn't. But the problem is that other things, which are not so obvious and self-evident, in the eyes of the supporters of these laws, count as gender identity discrimination. Let's take our hypothetical, where a trans person is seeking medical care. And instead of wanting a broken leg to get put in a cast, they want to undergo sex reassignment surgery. They want a plastic surgeon or an oncological surgeon to perform what is called top surgery, or they want a surgeon to do what's called bottom surgery. I don't think we need to get into the details of that, but you can understand why compelling medical professionals to do procedures like that, just like abortion is problematic, would be a problem, a conscience problem for many medical professionals. In addition to that, a lot of medical professionals and mental health professionals think this is absolutely the wrong response to someone who is suffering with gender dysphoria. So that's just but one example of how the Equality Act would take a good idea and twist it into something deeply, deeply troubling.
So if you were a physician and you had a conviction against performing the trans surgery, you would be compelled to do so by law, and you would not be able to follow your conscience. The freedom of conscience issue would be taken away from you, correct?
That's exactly right. Really, in two ways. I mean, there's two aspects of the civil rights law that would get you in a context like that. One is this idea of discrimination in places of public accommodation. I talked before about African Americans experiencing discrimination in hotels and restaurants. One of the other things the Equality Act does is it takes the relatively narrow definition of what's a place of public accommodation and dramatically expands it. And it definitely reaches healthcare providers. So there would be a law that says you got to perform this surgery. The double whammy comes with changing the law that attaches a non-discrimination string to every dollar of federal financial assistance. A lot of doctors, because of Medicare, Medicaid, and other programs, receive federal money. And if they receive that federal money, if they don't perform that surgery, they're going to lose out on all of that compensation for the services they do. So yes, is the short answer to your question.
Yeah, but then it also reaches into things that would be, I guess, pertinent to the religious community. So a Christian university or even a church, would that affect the ability of a university or a church in its hiring procedures to be able to hire somebody that was aligned with our New Testament doctrine? I mean, how would the Equality Act affect hiring procedures for universities and churches?
Yeah, well, in a sense, we're already facing that question, and here's why. I said before that the Equality Act would add sexual orientation and gender identity as protected classes in various non-discrimination laws, alongside things like race, color, religion, sex, national origin. Title VII has all of those things in it. What is Title VII? Title VII is a law that forbids discrimination in employment in the United States. So the Equality Act would add sexual orientation, gender identity, and make them protected classes. However, last year, almost exactly a year ago, the Supreme Court said in a case called Bostock that Title VII's ban on sex discrimination, which has been on the books since 1964, already forbids gender identity and sexual orientation discrimination. So in a sense, the Equality Act would ratify something that we already have. Now, what is the situation for religious employers? That's your real question, is what does that mean for religious employers, whether it's today under this Supreme Court decision that we thought was wrong, or under the Equality Act, which if it passes will ratify that decision. Here's the deal. Title VII has an exemption. It says, hey, look, if you're a religious employer, like your church, like Alliance Defending Freedom, like a Catholic Charities, you can't discriminate on the basis of race and things like that, but you can take religion into account when you're making your employment decisions. So, ADF has a policy that says if you want to work, you have to agree with our statement of faith, but there's also conduct standards. They're not limited to sexuality. They're not focused on sexuality, but they include sexuality. And here's the deal. There's a fight about whether that exemption that's been there since 1964 protects churches and parachurch ministries and social service agencies from claims of sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination. The folks on the other side of this issue who value LGBT interests more than religious liberty are saying, no, that exemption doesn't protect you. If you're a church and you believe that homosexuality is immoral, and you manifest that beliefs in your hiring practices, that's illegal, and you should be forced to hire people who reject your beliefs. So we're currently engaged in battles in the courts right now about that issue. The Equality Act would only make it worse.
Yeah. Now, wasn't there an amendment passed in 1994 that was supposed to protect religious freedom that is now the law of the land? Wouldn't the Equality Act kind of take that amendment and do away with it, that layer of protection for religious freedom?
Yes, that's exactly right. The statute is called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It was adopted by voice vote almost unanimously in the House, and I think the vote was like 97-3 or 99-1 or something like that in the Senate. Overwhelming majorities, bipartisan, of course, signed by President Clinton. What it does is it says if the federal government interferes with your religious exercise, if it burdens your religious exercise, then the government is required to prove in a court that it's got a really good reason for doing that. The language of the statute says, look, if you burden someone's religious exercise, you have to demonstrate that you are furthering, advancing, accomplishing a compelling governmental interest, a really important one, not just some garden variety interest, but a really serious one. And you've really got no other way to accomplish this objective. So it doesn't guarantee, this Religious Freedom Restoration Act, it doesn't guarantee that churches and individual believers are going to win their cases. It just gives them arguments. A best example recent of someone using this statute to protect their religious freedom was the debate over the HHS abortifacient mandate, the Hobby Lobby case. And then the follow-on case, which the lead case came out of Pittsburgh with Zubik, Bishop Zubik, was the lead named plaintiff in that case. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, you know what? You can't make people include abortifacients in their health plans in violation of their religious liberty. So that's one of the scariest things that the Equality Act does, is it takes the protection that statute afforded, and which many people have used, many people of all faiths have used, and takes it away and says, look, if you get sued under the Equality Act, under all of its provisions, you cannot invoke this statute at all. We're going to take one hand and tie it behind your back so that you can't defend yourself.
Yeah. So is there any kind of counter proposal of something that provides the proper level of protection for people based upon gender identity and sexual orientation without stripping the religious community of its freedom of conscience?
Yeah, there really is no adequate counter proposal. Some of the conversation in the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing suggested that perhaps there might be some ground. There was an exchange between Senator Durbin from Illinois, who's the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and Senator Tillis from North Carolina at the end of the hearing that suggested there may be some common ground. My own experience, and most informed observers think that common ground is not to be found. It bears noting that there was an effort to come up with some kind of compromise, and it was utterly and completely rejected. I'm referring, of course, to a proposal called Fairness for All. The Fairness for All Act is in a lot of ways like the Equality Act in that it adds sexual orientation and gender identity as protected classes to a number of existing federal non-discrimination laws. It's different from the Equality Act in that it doesn't take away the Religious Freedom Restoration Act rights, and it does have some religious exemptions. Now, here's the problem with Fairness for All. The religious exemptions are too narrow. They're not adequate. Number two, the whole premise of Fairness for All is that there's a conflict between LGBT interests and religious freedom. That leaves out an important piece of the puzzle. One of the biggest problems with gender identity non-discrimination rules is not the damage that they do to religious liberty, but the damage that they do to the interests of women and girls. Think of the situation involving athletics. Think about private spaces. When supporters of the Equality Act say no gender identity discrimination, what they're saying is you have to allow men who identify as women access to women's restrooms, locker rooms, changing stations, dressing rooms, and the like. And Fairness for All, again, thought it was dealing with two interests, and it ignored the third one, the women's interest. And that's one of the main reasons why most, I would say, the Catholic Bishops' Conference, the Southern Baptist Convention, Alliance Defending Freedom, many others have rejected Fairness for All. And no Democrats were willing to support it. A handful of Republicans, but not a single Democrat came forward. And you know why? It's because they're against the idea of religious exemptions. It's unfortunate that that's where they are. I wish there was more ground for conversation and discussion because in theory, there is some common ground, but politically there doesn't seem to be. Maybe that situation will change, but Fairness for All certainly is not the answer.
Now, if I'm correct in this, I think isn't there something going on right now with a small Christian college in Missouri? I think it's College of the Ozarks. Is that correct? Where
That's correct. Yes.
okay, and what you just mentioned, a female dorm, and there was a roommate put in together with a girl, and it was a man identifying as a girl, and now because they rejected that, they were sort of came under fire because of something. Am I correct in those facts?
Well, a little bit. There's one small correction I'll make. You essentially had it right. There was no circumstance where a male who identified as female was put into a woman's dorm. The college was rightfully concerned that that's how the current administration would interpret the law and require them to do so if that situation arose. Let me back up and explain how that came about. You might remember me saying earlier the Supreme Court decided this case in the employment context. They said that the employment statute's ban on sex discrimination included a ban on sexual orientation, gender identity discrimination that had been there for 64 years and we didn't notice it until just now. One of the things that's happening now is the Biden administration is taking that court case, which was about that statute, that was about employment, and transporting it over to other contexts. One of those contexts is the Fair Housing Act. That's a law that forbids discrimination in housing. And one of the things it forbids is sex discrimination. So the Biden administration has said sex discrimination, as it is outlawed in the Fair Housing Act, it includes sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination. And of course, take that one step further. The administration's understanding of what counts as gender identity discrimination includes this. A school says women's dorms are for biological women, but men's dorms are for biological men. And if you identify as the opposite sex, that's fine, but you're going to have to live in the dorm that's consistent with your biology. And so the College of the Ozarks didn't wait until a situation arose. They took preemptive action. They went on the affirmative, on the offensive, so to speak, and filed a lawsuit saying, hey, this can't be the law. This is wrong and it violates our religious freedom.
Okay, and what was the result of that?
Well, so the case is still at a preliminary stage. So a lot of times when you file a lawsuit, you can immediately ask the judge for some relief. The idea is like, let's keep the status quo going while the case goes on. And our attorneys who represent the College of the Ozarks asked for that, and the judge said no. Some interesting reasoning that wasn't exactly about the merits. We disagreed with the district court's decision respectfully and have filed an appeal to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit and are asking that court to give us the preliminary injunction, the order that maintains the status quo while the case goes on. And we're just waiting for that court to decide.
Oh, so that is actually your case.
It is an Alliance Defending Freedom case, yes.
Yeah, how about that? I didn't even know that. Okay, so and the other part of this, I think, for especially Christian schools and universities, is a lot of students go to these schools based upon grants that they personally get for their education. And if colleges and universities were not meeting the standards that the government outlines, students would not be eligible for those grants any longer, correct? Is that one of the?
Yeah, that's essentially correct. The schools are getting government money. That's a reality. Now it goes from, as you noted, it goes from the government to the qualified students, either loans or grants, and they kind of direct their aid wherever they want to go to school. As long as it's an accredited institution, they can send it there, including religious schools. And the government, at least in the past, has been careful to respect the autonomy of religious institutions and not change who they are by using this leverage that they have because of the money. Well, that would change under the Equality Act. A sexual orientation, gender identity, non-discrimination string would be attached to those dollars. And if a school believes that marriage is between one man and one woman, that God created us male and female, and that sex outside of marriage is contrary to biblical ethos, then and has policies that are consistent with those beliefs, then they're committing gender identity and sexual orientation discrimination in the eyes of the government. If you have if you have married housing and you reserve it to opposite sex couples, if you have rules against sex outside of marriage defined as one man and one woman, you're committing sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination. If you don't allow men to play on women's sports teams, you're committing gender identity discrimination. So it really does, the Equality Act would have a tremendously negative influence or effect on these schools. It would take away from students their ability to take the aid that they deserve and direct it to schools that share their beliefs in most circumstances. This is one of the toughest and most problematic aspects of the Equality Act. And that's why the colleges and the universities, many of whom I represent, are fighting very hard to prevent the adoption of this law.
Yeah, it really could mean that many of them would cease to exist. I mean, if it was interpreted as strictly as potentially it looks like, I mean, it would make it very difficult for a lot of schools to continue to function. So what is the likelihood that this passes? I know it already passed the Congress. What is the sense that you have? You're living in this world. I know this is something a lot of people are very concerned about, praying about. What's your projections?
Well, number one, keep praying, because that's the most important power that we have in this struggle for religious freedom and for God's understanding of marriage. But it hasn't passed the whole Congress. It did pass the House of Representatives in February. We know that President Biden will sign it if it reaches his desk. He has said so on many occasions. The real issue is the Senate. So, of course, the bill has been introduced in the Senate, and also the House version of the Equality Act, which is identical. When it passed the House, it does, what's supposed to happen. It goes over to the Senate, and the Senate is supposed to act on it. The Senate hasn't yet voted on the Equality Act. The only thing the Senate has done so far on the Equality Act is to hold a hearing. They do their hearings through committees. The Equality Act was assigned to the Senate Judiciary Committee. They held a hearing about 8 weeks ago now. I think it went pretty well for those of us who have concerns about the Equality Act. And now the question is, what's next in the Senate? And they have some options, but the supporters of the bill are facing a problem, a numbers problem. So right now, you and your listeners have been hearing about about the filibuster, and how most Senate legislation requires 60 votes to pass. Some talk about eliminating the filibuster. The Equality Act is one of those bills that it needs 60 votes to pass. And I think everyone in Washington would agree, and other observers would say, it doesn't have 60 votes. Not going to pass with 60 votes. The idea of abolishing the filibuster as a kind of step on the way to passing the Equality Act, that seems to be less and less likely. We're hearing announcements from a series of Democratic senators that they won't vote to abolish the filibuster. So it looks like the filibuster's probably going to stay in place at least for this Congress. And if that's true, then the Equality Act doesn't pass because it needs 60 votes. What if they abolish the filibuster? What if we're surprised by that and it goes away in this Congress? Then you need 50 votes. Vice President Harris, of course, would break the tie and would pass the question. So there were 50 Democrats and 50 Republicans, but only 49 Democrats sponsored the Equality Act. Interesting. Only 49, not all 50. Who didn't? Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who has often broken with his party on a number of issues, including the filibuster. He has not sponsored the Equality Act. That doesn't mean he can't vote for it. He might, but that signals to me that he has some difficulties with it. And I think that's the case, that he has concerns about the Equality Act. What about Republicans that have supported LGBT bills in the past, like Senator Susan Collins? Susan Collins from Maine supported the Equality Act, or sponsored it rather, in the last Congress. She didn't do so in this Congress. So maybe she's not a solid vote for the Equality Act as well. So even if the filibuster is abolished and the vote requirement drops from 60 to 50, there's a serious chance it doesn't pass even in that scenario. We're hearing, by the way, that there are some rumors circulating around Washington that there might be a floor vote on the Equality Act next week, a week from when we're recording this now. So stay tuned. It could be coming soon. And if it fails in this Senate, I can guarantee you that it'll be reintroduced in the next Congress, and we'll be having this discussion perhaps again.
Yeah. So, as a pastor, I feel so grieved sometimes with these kinds of issues because, we have a deep love for people, regardless of who you are, what your gender identity is, what your sexual orientation is. And yet we also have a deep love for the Word of God and understand the principles that are taught there, and have a high value on people's freedom of conscience, the ability to live according to your conscience. And this doesn't just affect Christians; it's Muslims, it's anyone who comes from a worldview that believes what has been historically the view of sexuality in marriage, which is that it's between a man and a woman in a covenant relationship. So this is the collision of two high values. We want people to feel safe in an environment where they have their civil rights, and we also want to protect freedom of conscience. It's tragic, I guess, that there is not the ability to have discussions where you can come to some kind of a middle ground spot. I guess that's one of the things I'm praying for, that somehow our nation would be healed where those kinds of decisions could take place. What would you recommend as an action step if somebody's concerned about this? What would you, besides prayer, any steps that someone could take that may have a particular burden about this?
Yeah, well, I think they should follow up on what you were just talking about. I am grieved as well as, opposition to things like the Equality Act and concerns about the medicalization of gender dysphoria and pumping girls full of puberty block and all that stuff. It gets misinterpreted by our friends on the other side of these issues as Christians having hate and being bigoted. And it grieves me that that's the interpretation of our stance. And I think we have to do all we can to try to dispel that caricature, that untruth, and share the gospel. I mean, the gospel is wrapped up in this issue of sexuality, creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. It's all there. And sexuality is just one example or one platform or one context in which all of that plays out. So I would hope that we would use this as an opportunity to advance the gospel. as far as affecting, the political conversation, I think it's great to be informed and educated by the Equality Act so you can explain why you're against it. Or if you're uncertain about it and learn to have your own position and be able to articulate it to friends and others who might have a different perspective, might be coming at this from a different direction. And finally, we live in a democracy, a democratic republic where we can have a voice with our elected officials. I think it's appropriate, particularly at this time, to communicate with Senate offices, certainly with your House representative, although the vote has already happened there. This issue is coming up in other contexts as well. We're going to see it in the future. So it certainly does not hurt to communicate with your elected officials. And it doesn't have to be, don't feel like you need to be over prepared for this. I mean, the reality is they're counting. They get calls and they get letters and they get emails, and they're keeping a tally. But if you perchance have a relationship with someone in an office and have a chance for a more in-depth conversation, certainly take advantage of it. I would encourage folks to get educated. There are some good resources on the ADF website, adflegal.org. And then we have another website called allforfreedom.com, where there's lots of great resources about all of these issues, touching on a variety of perspectives.
That's great. So if hypothetically it passed and there was a lawsuit that came down and it made it all the way to the Supreme Court, could the Supreme Court then overturn this as something that they would determine to be unconstitutional? And if that was the case, what's the likelihood that they would rule? I mean, based upon your understanding of things, because that would be the next battleground, correct?
Yes, you're right. I mean, if the Equality Act passes, there won't be one lawsuit, there won't be 10 lawsuits, there'll be many, many lawsuits. The answer to your question is yes and no. That's a very lawyerly answer, but there won't be a case in which the totality of the Equality Act is at stake. So there's not going to be a case where someone says the whole Equality Act is unconstitutional and the court says yes or no. That's not going to be the way it plays out. The way it's going to play out instead is folks who are adversely affected by the Equality Act will file a lawsuit saying, look, you need to protect us. Don't wipe out the entire law, but you need to protect us and people like us from the Equality Act. So you can imagine a lawsuit by 1, 5, 10, 100 Christian colleges and their students saying, look, you can't impose this rule on our institutions because you're going to strip us of the financial support that we need to keep going, or you're going to force us to change who we are. And if the court agrees with them and says, yeah, you're right, your religious freedom is being violated, the order that it would issue, the remedy that it would provide would protect those schools. It wouldn't stop Harvard from being subject to that law, or Stanford or some other place. So what I'm trying to say is there won't be like a single moment, right, where the Equality Act is up or down in a court. It will be a series of moments filed by employers, filed by creative professionals like Jack Phillips, the cake artist in California, in Colorado. It'll be cases like those, one after the other, where pieces of the Equality Act will be chipped away as applied to various contexts. We hope to never get there, but if we do, ADF is prepared to do the work and to partner with others.
Were you involved with that case too?
My colleagues were involved in that case. It is an Alliance Defending Freedom case. Jack Phillips, in addition to his case that went to the Supreme Court, is now facing further assaults on his liberty by a transgender activist who's also an attorney. You can check out our website for updates on that case. But Jack is an amazing man, and he's persevered through a lot of attacks. He has love in his heart for all people. He can serve everyone. He just can't create every message, and that's what these cases are all about. But yeah, I'm privileged to work with people, including my big boss, Kristen Wagner, who stood up in front of the Supreme Court and argued on Jack's behalf successfully.
So now, in that case in particular, the baker was willing to sell generally to everybody. There was no discrimination in general. It was just that he did not want to put a particular message on a cake. Is that?
Yeah, he didn't want to use the gifts that God had given him to create custom artwork, essentially. If you look at his designs and his work, it really is truly artwork. So yeah, if they wanted a wedding cake that was in the case, they could have had it. If they wanted a box of cookies, they could have had it. It's wrong to say that Jack Phillips discriminates against LGBT people. He doesn't. He just can't create certain messages. And not all the messages that he can't create have to do with sexuality. I mean, he doesn't celebrate cakes. Actually doesn't use alcohol in his cakes. He doesn't use cakes that are unpatriotic. I mean, he has a set of standards and beliefs that follow him to his workplace, that live inside him, and affect what he does on a daily basis. And he's not just focused on the sexuality issues. And that's the way it ought to be. We shouldn't compel artists to create art with which they disagree.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is a really unusual, but I think normal time for us now. This kind of thing is not going to go away. And we do appreciate those of you who are in the process of defending religious freedom. Thank you, Greg, for what you're doing. And we will be praying for you specifically as you're involved with this, that God would give you wisdom and revelation as to how to do your job well. Thanks for informing us on these issues. And maybe if things develop, we might have you back again to kind of update us on the process. So thanks so much for being a part today.